back to college once I moved to Horizon House, and so for the past 6 years I've been an access student at the University of Washington in history, and have been probably taking 15 or 20 courses, and it's been such a privilege to go back and have the experience of some wonderful, wonderful teachers. And one of the very best is Christoph Giebel, who we'll hear tonight. And going into his class, he is a very unique teacher. First of all, he doesn't use slides. He's using slides tonight, but he usually doesn't do that. He draws maps and draws them out, and he writes out script on DocuCam, and that he lectures, and it's so well organized. First third of the class is a review of what was said in the class before, and what was remarkable again was taking a class on the Vietnam War, or the history of the Vietnam Wars. And right away, it was unique in that Professor Giebel's perspective is that from the Vietnamese people. They call it the American War. They don't call it the Vietnamese War. And learning things like such that there's no such thing as the Viet Cong. You know, it wasn't a separate, there are all kinds of things that I learned that have no idea about the perspective of, and what's interesting is sitting in classroom, none of the kids are even born in Vietnam. And I don't know how this experience of everyone here knows about it, and I imagine given the composition of Horizon House, I imagine most of us were opposed to the Vietnam War and had participated in activities. But Christoph is born in Germany and grew up there, and his experience was at the age of 21, he was a conscientious, I didn't understand, Germany had a compulsory military service, and he was a conscientious objector, and was able to get a job and he was intending to go to medical school, hoping to go to medical school, but instead he got his job as a medic with a Red Cross, German Red Cross ship, hospital ship, that was stationed outside of an island in Indonesia, which was, and served the Vietnamese boat people. And there were, you know, thousands and thousands of Vietnamese boat people coming in desperate straits. And and he changed his mind. He just said, well, I don't want to be a doctor anymore. I want to be interested in Southeast Asian history. And that took a long, it was a journey. He ended up, he did go to university in Hamburg, but then he came to the United States and ended up at Cornell, where he did undergraduate, master's, and received his PhD at Cornell University, and ended up in an academic career. His love, though, of Vietnam, persisted. He learned, he became fluent in Vietnamese, he became fluent in Chinese, went to the University of Hanoi for a while, and became a scholar in the history of Vietnam and its neighbors. He came to the University of Washington in 1980. So he's been a professor since 1998 in the Jackson School, and is head of the Southeast Asia Study Program in the Graduate School of the Jackson School at the University of Washington. Just one story about Christoph. He believes very much in social justice, and a lot of his teaching has to do with the colonial powers who came to Southeast Asia and extracted wealth. And one story he told about was the story of the American war against the Philippines in 1898. And a couple of years ago, he noticed in Volunteer Park there was a memorial set up for the heroic volunteers who sought the freedom gave freedom to the Filipino people. And wasn't that the
liberated the oppressed people.
Liberated the oppressed people of the Philippines. And was it 200,000, or how many Filipinos died during the American war against the Philippines? Something like that. And in concert with members of the Southeast Asian community, was able to get that erased from the volunteer. Yeah. So, Christoph, the podium is yours.
Abe, thank you very much for this much more, or quite undeserved praise and introduction. But yes, you're quite right. So if you go to Volunteer Park now, to the water tower, you will see a stone slab without the plaque, which told a historical lie. So anyway, so you know, Abe is a model student. He's always there. He's very attentive. He asks good questions, and then also says nice things to flatter the professor. So I couldn't ask for more. And apparently he quite liked my class on the Vietnam War, and so he asked me to speak to you today. And I said, you know, what should I talk about? And he said, well, just tell them what you tell us. Only in 40 minutes. So I'm a little bit nervous about this. It's called Commonly Held Myths About the Vietnam War. And that's a tall order. So in 40 minutes, I will just hop around, give you a few examples. But the premise of this talk is basically that we have been using Western frames to tell the story of the war in Vietnam that served political purposes back in the 60s and 70s when they were basically established. But they are eliding core facts that when we move our focus from a kind of Western-centric to a Vietnamese-centric focus, suddenly things that happened in the war make much more sense than the ways that we try to explain things. Okay, so this is my premise of this talk, and I want to give you a few examples. And the few examples are mainly derived from maps or other visual representations drawn from American documentary films and also a few examples of a terminology that we are all very used to when we hear about the war in Vietnam, but from a Vietnamese perspective again are quite questionable and in many ways don't really make much sense. So I've been teaching about Vietnam at UW for 25 years, and I'm trained in Southeast Asian history, so my focus has always been to try to tell the stories of Vietnamese from the various perspectives of the Vietnamese and not the other way around, right? So here goes. In the interest of time, we're going to dive in, and the first mythology that I want to address is that some way or another France owns Indochina, right? France is the legitimate owner of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and owns it. And my example here comes from the 6-year-old Ken Burns, Lynn Novick documentary series on the Vietnam War. Some of you might have watched it, and it has its merits, but particularly the first episode from a historical point of view is wanting to be polite. If I had any hair left, I would have probably ripped it out watching that first episode. So here's first episode, 45 minutes in, and we have a map of the larger area of East and Southeast Asia in 1950. So you see that the documentary film is particularly concerned about the war in Korea right now. So the Korean War is happening, and you see the kind of communist forces now going over the 30 years parallel. There's an American flag as upholding, so to say, the Western orientation of South Korea. But what interested me is this depiction here, and that is that here's our country of Vietnam, and it has a French flag. So Ken Burns makes us believe that in 1950, the French were in control of Vietnam. And if we look closely, there's an odd flag here. So this is the flag of China, of Communist China. And here's an odd flag, and that is the flag of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. And the Democratic Republic of Vietnam was declared independent in 1945 by Ho Chi Minh in Hanoi. And as a nationalist, revolutionary in outlook, but nonetheless a nationalist, his Democratic Republic of Vietnam that he declared independent in 1945 was, of course, independent from all the way up here from the Chinese border all the way down to the Gulf of Siam. So one united, indivisible Vietnam. Why? Because the French had artificially divided Vietnam, once colonized, into 3 different parts, right? And so he declares it independent in 1945. But in this map of 1950, oddly enough, the flag of the Democratic Republic is not anywhere in Vietnam or actually in competition with the French flag. It's actually in southern China, where it really doesn't belong, right? So the implication here is for a casual viewer of this documentary, mind you, this is a screen grab, so we can look at it for several minutes now, but it's actually just a few seconds for a viewer, is the implication is this is Vietnam, and it belongs to the French. There's a French flag. So what you see here as my opening example is that, in fact, not just one, but 2 Vietnamese states that were existing at that point were erased. They're simply not there. So that sets the tone for the historical background in the Ken Burns documentary, that what counts is that there are Westerners there, and what Vietnamese have to say about their own country and about their own fates doesn't really matter. Now, I was talking about 2 countries, or 2 states, I should rather say. There are 2 states in Vietnam at that point. So I already introduced you to one, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, established in 1945 by Ho Chi Minh. But in 1949, when the French are really getting worried that they're losing the war against Ho Chi Minh's forces, they are they're allowing anti-communist Vietnamese to establish a rival state to Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic. And that rival state will be called the Associated State of Vietnam. Okay, but it goes back to 1949. In this image, it doesn't even exist. Right? But this is a crucial moment because our second mythology that I will talk about in a minute is that Vietnam was divided in two countries at Geneva in 1954. But if we really talk about a division of Vietnam, we have to go back to 1949 with the emergence of a second Vietnamese state. The first one, the Democratic Republic, was of course a revolutionary state. It was communist-led, nationalist of course in outlook too. But the second state that emerges in 1949 is run by anti-communist nationalists. The trick here to understand what is going on is that we should not look at a territorial division of Vietnam, but a political. Why? Because both Vietnamese states that were now established, 1945 and 1949, claimed to be legitimate, the sole legitimate authorities over all of Vietnam. Okay? So the division is a political one, but not a territorial one. Forces were intertwined. We're basically talking about a civil war among Vietnamese at that point. Now, since I don't have a whiteboard on which I can quickly draw my maps, I'm going to use hand signals that probably Abe knows very well. But the way we have to think about this is that in 1945 we have one Vietnamese state established, Democratic Republic, Chinese border down to the Gulf of Siam, right? So here's my cursor, Chinese border down to the Gulf of Siam. In 1949, we now have a rival state by anti-communist nationalists in Vietnam that claims exactly the same thing. So, two arms overlapping. So not a territorial division because they claim an indivisible Vietnam from the Chinese border down to the Gulf of Siam, but a political division because they are exclusivist and eliminationist. In other words, these two rival states do not recognize each other, of course, because they're all Vietnamese. They claim sole legitimacy for themselves. They want to eliminate the other state. Okay? Nothing of that already complexity among Vietnamese that you have in 1949 is visible in this Ken Burns map of 1950. Okay, so I'll leave it at that in the interest of time, and we're moving on to probably the biggest mythology of them all, and that is that in the Geneva Conference 1954, which came at the end of the French-Viet Minh War, the first Indochina War, and when the French had basically lost that war, that at this Geneva Conference in 1954, Vietnam was divided into two countries. Okay? That's a very standard way of framing things in the West, among our kind of standard ways in which we narrate the war. And sometimes I have little seminars, or I'm a guest speaker at the university for grad students, and I have them answer. I have them finish a sentence. I say, what happens at Geneva? At Geneva, 1954, Vietnam was, and then sure enough, my students answer divided into two countries, right? Or at least people say it was divided in two. Well, that is actually not true. What actually happened at Geneva? Geneva comes at the end of a long war that the French had, for all intents and purposes, lost. Okay, so the French are now trying to hold on to as much Vietnam as possible, knowing that some concessions will have to be made to the revolutionary armies that defeated them. And involved are the Chinese communists, and I'll leave others out of this because we have to focus on the main players. Now, what happened with the Chinese communists? They had just established a new state after the Chinese Revolution in 1949. And as they have shown in Korea, they are reacting to American threats on their border. They're intervening in Korea in 1950 when American forces are moving towards the Chinese border. And they're perfectly happy to settle the war in Korea back at the 38th parallel. So the Chinese came to Geneva with two objectives. They did not want American forces on the border, and they wanted to have a pro-communist rump state on their border. And that is how Geneva is actually settled, because the French, who wanted to hold on to some rump state of Vietnam, and the Chinese, who really didn't care about a united Vietnam, found that they had common interests, because with a de facto division of Vietnam in 1954, both of them hoped to keep America out of Vietnam. So in the final analysis, if we look at Geneva 1954, the Accords of Geneva were an agreement to keep America out of Vietnam. Okay? And that's basically because the French and the communist Chinese agreed on that one point. Okay? But how did Vietnamese look at Geneva? Well, we have, of course, a situation where since 1949 we have already two states in existence. And they both insisted that Vietnam was indivisible and should never be divided. And so the compromise at Geneva was that the division was in two military recruitment zones that were conditional and temporary. Okay, so these are the core terms that we have to understand. It was not a political border. It was a military demarcation line in two recruitment zones. So revolutionary forces would vacate the southern half and move to the northern recruitment zones. French forces and those of the associated state would move south to the recruitment zone. But it was not a recognition of a political border, because neither of the Vietnamese states would ever accept a divided Vietnam. Okay? So this is one of the greatest mythologies, right? In Western discourses, we're used to thinking, oh, Geneva comes along in 1954, and bang, we suddenly have not just one Vietnam, but we actually have two countries. One we call North Vietnam, and the other one we call South Vietnam, and there's a political border. Well, it was not a political border, and it was also conditioned on reunification elections to be held in 1956. Okay? So, in other words, for the Vietnamese, Geneva was a painful concession. They had to concede that for 2 years their territory had to be partitioned into two military recruitment zones, but then there would be elections to be held where basically the two states, all Vietnamese states, would run against one another. And the Vietnamese would have to decide whether or not they preferred the Democratic Republic established in 1945 or the Associated State established in 1949. And the winner take all. Okay, so that was the election condition that made the military recruitment zones temporary, 2 years. Okay, so that's of course not what happens, because you have then American intervention. The anti-communist state is uniting, kicking the French out very quickly, inviting Americans in, and then renaming their country the Republic of Vietnam. Okay, so now we have a northern-based Democratic Republic claiming all of Vietnam, and a southern-based, Saigon-based Republic of Vietnam, American supported now, which claims all of Vietnam as well. Okay? So, but that point, which is an important point, that all Vietnamese, despite their strong ideological differences, and they're killing each other, but all Vietnamese nationalists agreed, and they in fact insisted that it would be written into the Geneva Accords that Vietnam was indivisible. So the territorial integrity of one Vietnam was actually part of the Geneva Accords. Now, compare this to how we discussed the Geneva as the place where Vietnam is divided into two countries, and you see that actually it flies in the face of historical facts. The historical fact is that Geneva reaffirmed the principle of a united Vietnam and did not divide into two countries. So when Ken Burns' series came out in 2017, the local NPR station, KCTS, had several previews in the city, and they had a kind of running Vietnamese timeline, Vietnam history timeline, and it was kind of flickering across the screen, so I had to quickly shoot it with my camera, so it's a little bit out of focus. But I just want to show you this example here, right? So the Vietnam timeline, according to KCTS and according to Ken Burns, is that in 1954, Vietnam signs the Geneva Accords and divides into two countries. Now, I still don't understand the sentence today, and I've looked at it for 6 years. Vietnam, what Vietnam? Because we know that there were actually two Vietnams, one established as an independent, united Vietnam in 1945, the other one in 1949. But this undefined Vietnam signs the Geneva Accord, so makes it official, and divides, kind of what, osmotically, right? Divides into two countries. So here we have a very good example of how the Western frames are used to establish a narrative that is convenient for American purposes, because America intervenes to defend an anti-communist South Vietnam as a putatively separate country from North Vietnam, but which completely elides the visions and lived experiences of Vietnamese of all stripes, be they anti-communist or communist or anybody in between. Because Vietnamese nationalists, again, agreed on the principle that Vietnam was indivisible. They had lived, after all, 80 years under the French and forced partition. Okay? So, I don't want to take any sides. When I refer to this fact of the existence of two Vietnamese states, I don't take any sides whether or not one is more legitimate as the other. My point is, these are Vietnamese political ambitions, visions of the nation that are competing with one another, and they have equal validity. Okay, so I don't want to say that the Democratic Republic of Ho Chi Minh had more claims to the nation than Ngo Dinh Diem's in 1954 or so in Saigon, because again, both of them claimed all of Vietnam. Okay? So, let me show you something else, which brings me to my third mythology, which of course builds up on Geneva. Okay? And that is the mythology that the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, was a political border and therefore could not be violated. But if you take seriously Vietnamese approaches to their own country, then you realize, of course, that the DMZ was never accepted as a political border by either of the two states, nor was it actually accepted when the Geneva Accords broke down. And they broke down with the refusal of the Saigon state to hold reunification elections, because they knew they would lose them. Okay? So if the DMZ, from a Vietnamese point of view, is a conditional and temporary partition line, and the process that would eliminate it is not executed, then it doesn't really have this kind of highly symbolic value that it had for American discourses. The DMZ in American discourses becomes this last line of defense against communism. It's a political border. Here is South Vietnam, we defend South Vietnam, and there's North Vietnam. And the North Vietnamese have nothing of any business to do in the South, right? If they now come down south, they're invaders, okay? Now, I want to give you two examples from the war years, how what we call South Vietnam was actually thinking about this. And again, it flies in the face of very dearly held Western frames about the war. So here's a 1964 propaganda board in the main intersection of Saigon by the Saigon government, so the ally of the United States. The United States calls them South Vietnam. They call themselves the Republic of Vietnam. And here you see a propaganda board that says all people should be united in defending the southern region and to liberate the northern region. Okay? So what the Americans called South Vietnam as a separate country was actually openly, publicly propagating moving up north through the DMZ and to, quote-unquote, liberate the northern zone. And not only in '64, when things were not as dire for Saigon, but also in 1972, a postage stamp from the Republic, so-called South Vietnam in American discourses, Saigon government. In 1972, when actually the military situation was already quite dire for Saigon, they published a postage stamp in which you see a very similar scene. Right? The flag of the Republic, yellow with 3 red stripes, and they are planting this flag in northern Vietnam, which they paint red because it's communist held. And in this image that recounts the famous scene of Iwo Jima, the flag planting of Iwo Jima by US Marines, here Southern soldiers are planting the Republican flag in northern Vietnam, and it again says, the people united to prepare to march north. Okay? So, what I want to show you with these two images is that not only did what we call North Vietnam aspire to, quote-unquote, liberate the South, what we call an invasion of North Vietnam into South Vietnam, but that actually during its existence, the allies of the Americans, the Republic of Vietnam, was very open that they, if they had the opportunity, would do exactly the same, only in reverse. They would have had no compunction breaking through the DMZ and moving north to liberate Vietnam and unite it, because the indivisibility of Vietnam was the highest good for all Vietnamese nationalists. So the DMZ and the way we talk about it as a political border between two supposed separate, discrete countries is really a kind of fetish in Western discourses. But it was not reciprocated by Vietnamese themselves. Okay? Now, the fourth mythology. The southern-based Viet Cong, or to use its proper title, the National Liberation Front of Southern Vietnam, in this mythology is simply a creation of quote-unquote North Vietnam. Right? Because it is allied with revolutionary nationalism, aka Hanoi, Democratic Republic. It is therefore an appendix and creation of North Vietnam. By the terminology that we're using, we're therefore normatively assigning the northern zone only to North Vietnam, to the Democratic Republic. But normatively, we're assigning the southern zone only to the Republic, the Saigon government, United States allies. Now again, nothing has changed from the original division of Vietnam of two overlapping states that claimed all of Vietnam exclusively for themselves and wanted to eliminate the other. But in Western discourses, we make them into two discrete countries, and now if North Vietnam tries to get involved in the southern zone, we call this an invasion of South Vietnam. Okay? What is elided here, what is ignored here, is that many Southerners were in fact opposed to the Saigon government. They were long-standing, deep-seated, oftentimes generation-old networks of nationalist or revolutionary nationalist resistance. And when it was becoming clear by the late 1950s that no unification elections would be held, the National Liberation Front was founded by Southern revolutionaries with minimal support by Hanoi, and they made stunning inroads into the southern countryside. So we have to really understand, despite the mythology that they are completely a creation of Hanoi and are completely dependent on Hanoi, that until 1964, the southern resistance with minimal weapons made stunning inroads in the southern countryside. That tells me that it must be very deep-seated to have this kind of success. Now, let's go to a map that I found declassified from the CIA. Okay, so this is a map that depicts the force distribution in 1963 south of the demilitarized zone in what the Americans call South Vietnam. Okay? And you see in pink and red areas where the Viet Cong, the National Liberation Front, are now projecting power or in outright control. So outright control is deeper red. Here is Saigon. You see that the southern resistance has control over many areas in the immediate vicinity of Saigon. Already in 1963, when Hanoi, in fact, wasn't even involved in the south. Okay? So, what this calls for is that we have to revise our thinking about the Viet Cong as being simply appendices of a communist North Vietnam, and have to understand them in their own right as people who have agency, who have their own vision of Vietnam, and who take matters in their own hands. So what you see here is a map that is oftentimes referred to as a leopard skin map. Because as the war drags on now into the 1960s, opposing forces are becoming more and more intertwined. Okay, so revolutionary forces of the NLF, the National Liberation Front, the Viet Cong, and then forces of the Republic of Vietnam, what the American discourses would call the South Vietnamese Army. But mind you, we have a second South Vietnamese Army, and that is the National Liberation Front, who on its own accord, by 1963, had wrested about 1/3 of the countryside from the Saigon government. Okay, so we have to really revise this and keep in mind that from the early 60s on, there was no unified southern Vietnam. Okay? It was, of course, claimed by both states. So the Democratic Republic, of course, laid claim on southern Vietnam as an indivisible part of their own country. Saigon did the same, of course, claimed North Vietnam as well. But the NLF, the Southern Resistance Movement, now was also holding large part of that territory. Okay? And yet, we are continuously talking about South Vietnam as if it was normatively assigned to the Republic. Right? So we're falling back on these claims that South Vietnam was a separate country and normatively assigned only to Saigon. That flies in the face of how Vietnamese of all stripes defined how their country should be like. Okay? Let me move in steps, two-year steps further to stay with these maps. Now, between 1963 and 1965, major things happened. Okay? And we don't have the time to go into that. But there is the Tonkin Gulf incident, the incident that Lyndon Johnson used to justify American involvement. So Americans are now pouring in with combat forces by early 1965. And of course, to counter that, regular forces of the Democratic Republic, what American discourses call the North Vietnamese Army, are now moving onto southern battlefield as well. They want to support the NLF against the rising American combat mission. So, in other words, in 1963, we have a combat map, right, a military map of what is more or less a civil war between the Southern National Liberation Front and the Saigon Army. But 2 years later, we have the introduction of two more forces, American forces and the regular army of the Democratic Republic, what we call the North Vietnamese Army. This is 1965. So you see that in 2 years, so now yellow used to be Saigon, now it is blue. Communists stay red. You see that in 1965, with the introduction of American forces and regular forces from the north, southern Vietnam becomes increasingly fragmented. And in fact, the majority now of southern territory is under communist control. 2 years later, 1967, you see that American ground forces, with their strategy of attrition, have produced an even more fragmented southern military map. So even communist forces that in 1965 had actually quite a lot of territory, contiguous territory under their control, are now also fragmented, but you see the diminishing hold of the Saigon forces. In blue, 1965, so in yellow, 63, holding about 2/3 of the southern countryside. In 1965, less than half. In 1967, what we call South Vietnam is in fact an archipelago state of disparate islands, mainly cities, and the immediate environment around them. Okay? So this is 1967. But in Western discourses, we are still normatively assigning Saigon legitimacy over all of what we call South Vietnam. The reality is what you see here. Okay? Here's a screen grab again from Ken Burns. This is 1966. And he is talking about a localized campaign, military campaign in Binh province. Binh province is somewhere down here, okay? So it's southern central Vietnam. But you see here's the DMZ. The map that he shows us when he narrates this story of a firefight in Binh Dinh in 1966, the map is a flat map that has only the flag of what he called South Vietnam and what was officially called the Republic of Vietnam. The Republic that, as you know, I'm repeating myself over and over again to try to break through the frames, South Vietnam, right? A republic that did not claim to be just South Vietnam, but that claimed to be all of Vietnam. And actually made openly, publicly, made plans to move north if the opportunity would arise. But Ken Burns is so wedded to the Western framing of the war that he produces a flat map and assigns only one flag, and that is of the Republic. If he was true to what the actual situation on the ground was in 65 or 67, he could not produce a flat map like this. So in other words, what this map indicates is again the Western tendency to assign normative legitimacy only to one of the two contending states over what Americans or the West called, quote-unquote, South Vietnam. Right? So all this complexity of Vietnamese visions of the nation and of political and military reality are completely erased in a map that looks at first glance as completely legitimate. Okay? So, Abe, you have to tell me when it's time to wrap up. Is it time to wrap up?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm not going to go to the end of the war, and we can do that in question and answer, but let me just now move to what that means in terms of how we frame and how we talk about the war. If we assign Geneva the power to have divided Vietnam into two countries, not true, but that's what we are claiming, and there's a legitimate South Vietnam and then a North Vietnam, then it has consequences for how we narrate the war and how we use terminology, okay? And that differs, of course, with the terminology that Vietnamese would use for the same war. So, in other words, when forces of the Democratic Republic move to the southern battlefields on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, around the DMZ, because American forces are now in the south, then this is, according to Western framing, an invasion of North Vietnam into the sovereign country of South Vietnam. And that's bad, right? It's an invasion. It's an act of aggression by North Vietnamese communist forces into South Vietnam. It makes no sense for Vietnamese, though, because for Vietnamese, Vietnam was undivided. And it was only natural that when Southern revolutionary forces were now facing American Marines, that forces from the Northern Zone would now come to their aid. So nobody in Vietnam nowadays talks about a North Vietnamese invasion into South Vietnam. It would just make no sense, because Vietnam is indivisible. And other terms that we're using, infiltration, insurgency, all relegate those on the revolutionary side as illegitimate and only lift up Saigon forces as the only legitimate ones in the South. Now, I'm not saying that they were illegitimate. I'm saying that both visions of the nation had equal validity, but we have to find a way to talk about this and to render it in maps and other visual representations that is true to the complexity and to the lived experiences of Vietnamese. The effect of this kind of simplifying into simple binaries, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, invasion into the south, and to relegate the NLF as simply a handmaiden of Hanoi is also to erase that so many Southerners were in fact opposed to the Saigon government, the allies of the Americans. So in other words, when we create these flat maps, we are also de-Southernizing Southern resistance fighters. We're simply claiming they are no longer Southerners, they have no legitimacy, they have no claim to this area that they actually called their home. Okay? So I leave it at that. I ran out of time, but I'm happy to answer questions, particularly also when it comes to later times in the war. Thank you.
Who are our runners?
A question. With Saigon,
Someone's going to bring you a mic.
would Saigon have ever not gone through this vote in 1956 or 7 without America's support? And if they didn't have American support, would they have dared not to do the vote?
I believe they have no choice. They had no choice other than to deny the vote, yes. And the way they did this actually is very clever, because the Associated State of Vietnam, created in 1949, I didn't mention this in my talk, but I can tell you now, didn't have full sovereignty. So it had large areas of autonomy, but the French still claimed sovereignty over military affairs and foreign affairs and finances. And therefore, when the Associated State of Vietnam refused to sign the Geneva Accords in 1954, it didn't matter because the French signed for them. So when Nguyen Xuyen, who will eventually rule over Saigon and the Republic of Vietnam, comes to power, he uses a trick. He defeats the leader of the Associated State, he's prime minister. He defeats the president in sham elections, becomes president himself, and then declares the Associated State of Vietnam abolished and to replaced by the Republic. That achieves, so, excuse me if I just go into detail a little bit, but it achieves two goals. He can now say, well, we are the Republic, we have full sovereignty, and the French have to leave now because they have no more reason to be here, invites the Americans in. And the second reason is that he says the Republic was not part of the Geneva Accords, and therefore we will not honor the elections.
Yeah, another question, as I understood it, Ho Chi Minh was communist trained in Moscow.
Sure.
But he was first and foremost a nationalist. And he had asked for American support to keep the French out of recolonizing Vietnam. Is this true?
It is true, yes. So I don't really make a distinction between communists and nationalists because communism is a political ideology. Nationalism is much more a cultural ideology. And therefore, I have no problem to say that communists are nationalists too. So that my distinction is between revolutionary and anti-communist nationalists in Vietnam. But nonetheless, some of you might know that there's a brief moment in 1945, just before the Declaration of Independence, where Ho Chi Minh's ragtag forces are collaborating with American agents against the Japanese. And through these agents, he is sending out feelers to Washington to plead for recognition of his newly independent, united Vietnam that had abolished French colonialism. And he never gets an answer.
I just wanted to make a comment that I was there in 2004 or 5, and we were just in Hanoi in that upper area, and so that picture you had of 1965 in Saigon was very interesting because they had cars. And in Hanoi, in 2004, you never saw a car. There were thousands, hundreds of bicycles. In fact, our guide said, now we're going to walk across the street, and if you can't stand it, because all these bicycles were coming at you, he said, just close your eyes and walk slowly.
Yeah. Still true today.
Yeah, and they
all Vietnam was cars and motorcycles.
Yeah, so it was, I don't, you know, it was amazing for me to see that there was a totally different life there, and also the fact that they called, in the North, they called it the American War.
Yes. Yes.
Any other questions? I'm going to enter, yes.
I was working in Hawaii in a low-income area as a librarian. And can you explain we were swamped with refugees, families with children. As a matter of fact, our library got a grant because we had so many Vietnamese refugees. Where did they come from? They certainly weren't the ones that were in the swamps and you know, that you see in the movies and the war.
Right.
Which side were they on?
Well, I mean, the Republic of Vietnam is defeated in 1975 by forces of the Democratic Republic. So the two states that both claimed all of Vietnam
so which state?
and wanted to eliminate each other. The revolutionary state eventually defeats the anti-communist state.
So
the anti-communist state that I showed you, its actual extent in 1967 year doesn't really change very much over the course.
I think you're talking about the boat people,
right.
The refugees.
Right.
Well, I'm not sure that the refugees that I saw and worked with were necessarily poor. I mean,
they're mostly southerners of the defeated state, the republic. And as I try to show you here in this, the republic has to be understood not as a state that uniformly controls all of what we call South Vietnam, but that for large portions of the war was actually reduced to an urban environment. So the refugees of the defeated state who lost their country, of course, and heartbreaking as it is, where usually their background was urban and upper middle class.
Yeah, and probably working, well, I hate to, I'm using the wrong terminology, but they were working with American forces.
Yes,
too.
and they were anti-communist nationalists who, unfortunately for them, had lost that civil war against communist nationalists.
And they certainly didn't represent all of Vietnam.
No.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask a question, another part. The United States decided to leave, and did the communist government agree to allow the United States troops to leave and turn the war over to the South Vietnamese government? And in exchange, the Americans left with impunity. And there were, however, that led to bombing that you said Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam, and parts of Vietnam. That was 8 times the number of bombs dropped in that period as the Second World War.
Yeah, I mean, the number is staggering. It doesn't really have to do with the Americans leaving, but over the course of American involvement in Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, about 9 times the tonnage of all theaters of World War II was unloaded over into China. Yes, let me just give, before I get to that question, I want to give you one example. I'm affiliated with an NGO here in Seattle called Peace Trees Vietnam that has been a very good partner for my students that I take to Vietnam from time to time. And they are working in alleviating the still lingering problems of unexploded ordnance. And of course, most unexploded ordnance is still around the area of the DMZ, where the fighting was the most intense. And the DMZ is in a province called Quang Tri. Quang Tri province is a little bit smaller than King County in size. So think of King County, but a little bit smaller. And in the war, Quang Tri absorbed about 1.5 times all explosives of all theaters of World War II combined in an area smaller than King County. There was a question.
I visited Vietnam in 2019, and my wife had students from there, and the divisions still exist. The one particular student who studied here in the United States, when she went back, had a hard time getting a job. And then they wouldn't allow her to travel back to the US for a conference. So it seems like the Democratic Republic won, and they're still reinforcing that division.
Well, there have been long-standing regional divisions among Vietnamese that go back centuries. They don't really map very easily on what we call North Vietnam and South Vietnam. They're much more mapping onto 3 regions: the north, around the Red River Delta, the long center, which had its own identity, and then the deep south around Saigon. And there are regional tensions just like we have regional tensions in our own country. But you're quite right. I mean, 1975, one vision of the nation wins over the other and establishes an autocratic regime, a communist government that is still in power. It's a one-party state. Calls itself communist. I don't think it has very much to do with the ideology of communism, but it's an autocratic regime. And there is suspicion, of course, particularly students who are now trained in the West. So I have had students from Vietnam study with me, and one of them got her PhD with me, and she decided not to go back because she realized that she would not have much of a career to look forward to because she was already kind of Western trained, and that was regarded with suspicion. That's another topic. This is not the topic of this talk, right? So I don't want to deny that, you know, we have of course, human rights violations in Vietnam right now. What I was going to talk about here is really how the Western frames that we use, the terminology that we're using to narrate the Vietnam War, when seen from a Vietnamese perspective, doesn't actually make sense, right? And it elides core facts that produced the war.
Okay, we'll take 2 more questions.
Was there a nationalist, anti-communist movement in the North?
There was, until 1954, right? So, as I said, the 2 states that emerged, 1945 and 1949, right? 2 overlapping states, all claiming all Vietnam. They were, of course, anti-communist nationalists in the North as well. They were particularly concentrated in the Northern Catholic communities, which were very strong. In the wake of the Geneva Accords in 1954, however, there was a provision that for 1 year, civilians could cross the DMZ to choose which of the 2 military recruitment zones they wanted to live in until reunification elections. And kind of seeing the writing at the wall that most likely the communist state would prevail in elections, in free elections of all Vietnamese. Many of the anti-communist nationalists in the north chose to move south, where now Americans had backed up the southern Saigon government of the republic. So that means that a lot of those who could have been a counterweight to revolutionary nationalism in the north had voluntarily left. And they became actually oftentimes the most fervent military leaders in what we call the South Vietnamese army. It was actually oftentimes led by northerners who had lived under communism and were fervently anti-communist. Right? So again, here you see the slippage in the terminology that we're using. And it would be much more appropriate to use terminology that would actually talk about the realities in which Vietnamese were living. Good question.
One last question.
I want to thank you.
Get it on.
Is that on? I was part of the very early March '65 as a naval officer into Vietnam, and spent 6 months in the Tonkin Gulf in the coast, with about 10 days in Saigon en route out. But I had a chance to go back to Vietnam 2011, and we had a fabulous tour guide who we started out in Laos and into Hanoi and worked our way south. But he brought up something, and he would talk privately in our small bus, talking about the pecking order, about, you know, you've got a communist government that's 3 or 4 million that are communists and the rest of the Vietnamese population. But what he pointed out was that for him, who was the second generation, third generation, he could only go so far. And it's the third generation of those who fought with or supported the Americans,
Yes.
that they can then really fully enter back into the Vietnamese society. But unless you're there, you do get cut out of jobs and opportunity.
Yes. And that explains also why there was a question from Hawaii, right? Why so many southern Vietnamese left after 1975 in several waves. Because after 1975, the victorious vision of a nation establishes a united Vietnam under communist rule, and there is, at least in the first phase, a very open policy of kind of collective punishment against those who were fighting for the Republic, for the Saigon government, and on the American side. That has now the open discrimination has alleviated, but I think you're quite right. There are probably lingering issues still of those who are associated with, you know, grandfather fought with the Americans or so. There is, of course, a suspicion and a question of trust. Yes. So if Vietnam had a more democratic and open society, that would probably take care of itself, but it does not.
Okay, I want to thank you so much